Chapter 5. Carter. Carter cupped his hand around his mouth and exhaled, checking his breath one more time. After the tux fitting with the guys, he decided to go ahead and give April a call. He figured if he took her out and found that she was a religious nut, he could simply bring another date and avoid her at the wedding. But if she wasn't, and he had fun with her, then maybe he could seal the deal at the wedding, if not before. After all, bridesmaids and groomsmen hooking up was generally a tradition, wasn't it? He brushed the shoulders of his shirt and then strutted up the walk to April's front door. There was no doorbell, so he rapped on the door and then leaned back. When the door opened and April smiled at him from the other side, he returned the grin. Not only was he relieved she had answered instead of Lucia, but she looked gorgeous. The green of her outfit made her red hair pop and enhanced her eyes, making them shine like emeralds. "Wow, you look amazing," he said, as his eyes took in her skinny jeans and heels. "Thanks. You look pretty snazzy yourself." Snazzy. Now there was a word he hadn't heard in a long time. Yet somehow it didn't seem odd spilling from April's lips. There was something about her bubbly personality that just worked. And he could already tell this night would be enjoyable. "Well, shall we?" he asked, holding out his arm. She tossed her head back as she slipped her hand through his arm. "We shall." With her free hand, she closed the door behind her and then leaned closer to him as they walked to his car. A floral aroma floated around her, as did the scent of desire. This was the scent he liked the most. It was different from the desperation some women exuded. They needed his fame, his money, his attention. But desire was different. She wanted those things, but she didn't need them. She would be able to find other men on her own, which meant she wouldn't be needy. A small smile lifted the corners of his mouth as he opened the door for her. He had a feeling they might get along well. "What did you have planned for tonight?" April asked, when they were both in the car and buckled. "Dinner, and maybe a walk along the river." He had wanted to keep the evening simple, in case it didn't work out, but also flexible in case it did. April nodded and twirled a strand of hair around a finger, but she didn't seem entirely impressed by his plans for the evening. Perhaps she'd been hoping for something fancier, but the restaurant he'd picked was nice, not super expensive. There was no need to take a first date to one of those places, but the food was good and the service was acceptable. "How long have you been playing football?" she asked. It was clear she was trying to fill the silence, but Carter didn't mind. He didn't enjoy uncomfortable silences either. "Since high school. It was the one thing I could get my dad interested enough in to come watch. So I guess I started playing more for him. Then I found I enjoyed it and just kept going." He realized as soon as he finished that he'd probably said too much, and he hoped she didn't push the subject. Talking about his father was certainly no way to get the date off on a good foot. "Did your dad work a lot?" she asked. "Yeah." There was more he could say on this topic, but he didn't want to trample through the past. "Yours?" For a second, April tensed, and he sensed that her past was also a touchy subject. "I wish. My dad was a drunk. I don't remember him ever having a job, though I suppose he did at one time." "I'm sorry." As tough as his situation was, hers sounded tougher. His dad had become an alcoholic too, but thankfully he'd been the quiet, secluded kind. The kind who came home without a word, grabbed a drink from the fridge, and locked himself in his office all night. His father had been neglectful, but he'd had friends whose fathers had been the angry verbal or physical kind, and he wondered what kind April's father had been. He opened his mouth to ask, but then decided this topic was too heavy for a first date, and changed the topic instead. "So Jefferson tells me you're a massage therapist." April brightened, and the dark cloud receded from her face. "I am. I work in a chiropractor's office currently, but I'm hoping to get my own space soon." "Don't get me wrong, I love massages. But how did you get involved in that? Did you just wake up one day and think, I wonder how awesome it would be to rub strangers for a living?" A high-pitched noise that Carter could only assume was her laugh spilled from April's mouth before she clasped a hand over her lips. Though it wasn't the most endearing or feminine laugh, there was something about it that made Carter smile. "I'm sorry," April said when her shoulders stopped shaking. "My laugh is awful." "I didn't think it was that bad," Carter said, pulling into the parking lot of the restaurant. "In fact, I think it was kind of cute. But you didn't answer my question." April smiled and shook her head. "No, I didn't wake up one day and think about rubbing strangers for a living. I had actually planned to be a dancer, but I messed up my ankle pretty badly one recital, and that ended my ballet career. Thankfully, I had a great personal trainer who introduced me to massage, and she gave me a new purpose for my life. I would never achieve my dream, but I could help others achieve theirs." Carter had not expected that answer, and he wasn't sure he would have been as resilient if he'd been in her shoes. "Wow, that's really noble." "It also pays pretty well and helps that I can set my own hours," April said, turning the conversation light once again. This time, Carter chuckled. "That does sound nice. I have a decent amount of time off, but during the season, I am never in charge of my own hours." He parked the car and turned the engine off before turning to April. "You ready?" She smiled. "As I'll ever be." A few minutes later, they were seated at a table near the back and perusing the menu. Carter had already decided on the steak, and now he was enjoying the appreciative looks shot in April's direction. She was either used to them or unaware, as they did not seem to faze her in the least. "Everything looks so good. I can't decide. What are you having?" It was an innocent question, but when she looked up at him, he could see the flirtation in her eyes. He decided to play along. "I'm having the steak. Everyone knows that the best steak, like a lot of other things, comes from Texas." "I've heard that," she said with a coy smile. "But what other things?" "The best rodeos, the best football games, and..." He leaned forward and covered her hand with his. "The best-looking women." Though he was sure she knew how pretty she was, a soft pink blush graced her cheeks anyway. "And here I thought it was just the best cowboys." "Well, we have the best of those, too." Their flirtation was interrupted by the waitress coming to take their order. "Sorry to keep y'all waiting. Do you know what you want?" The waitress was an older woman who, though friendly, looked as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Her graying hair was pulled into a lackluster bun, and her pencil tapped softly at the pad in her hand. "Ladies first," Carter said, leaning back and letting April order first. Following his suggestion, she ordered the steak, and Carter was intrigued that she liked her meat the same temperature he did, medium well. "Make that 2, he said when April finished, and the waitress nodded before turning back to the kitchen. "I'm really glad you called," April said. "I think we're going to have fun together." "I'm glad I called too," Carter said, taking her hand again. "And I think you might be right." They filled the rest of the evening with small talk and smiles, and Carter was almost disappointed when the food was gone and it was time to go. He paid the check and then led the way back to the car. "I guess we'll have to do that walk another time," he said, when he pushed open the door and stepped into the approaching darkness. "Is that your way of asking me on a second date?" April asked. "Because if it is, I agree." Carter chuckled at how easily he'd stepped into that one. Still, he wasn't that upset about the prospect of a second date with April. He honestly couldn't remember the last time he'd had a better evening with a woman. Okay, it's a date then. The ride back to April's place wasn't filled with chatter, but this time the silence didn't feel awkward. Carter marveled at how comfortable it felt with April already. When he pulled up to her house, he put the car in park so he could walk her to her door. Though occasionally this would be the time he would schmooze his way into the woman's bedroom, he found he didn't want that with April. Once he crossed that line, it was usually the last time he saw the woman, and for some reason, he wanted to see April again, so he opted for the slower route. "I had a good time tonight," he said, grabbing her hand when they reached the door. "Me too." He could see the desire in her eyes. It was a look he was familiar with, and he hoped she wouldn't be too upset when he didn't push for more. At least, not yet. "I'll call you soon about that walk." "Okay," she whispered in a breathy voice. Her eyes slid to the door, as if hoping he would catch her silent invitation and ask to come in. "I have an early practice tomorrow," he said, hoping that would ease her disappointment. "But thank you again for a great night." Her lips pulled into a small smile, and she nodded. Carter used that as his cue and leaned forward to plant a soft kiss on her lips. He wanted so much more, but he forced himself to keep it sweet and simple, and he could tell when he pulled back that he definitely left April wanting more. He squeezed her hands one more time before turning and heading back to his car. There was one more stop he had to make before heading home for the night. It was late when Carter rolled into Jay's driveway, but Jay had promised he would be up. Carter had met Jay in college, but Jay had moved to the area years before Carter. They'd lost touch for a while, but when Carter transferred to the Tornadoes, they'd picked up where they left off. Though not quite as famous as Carter, Jay had started his own biotech company and was slowly climbing the ladder of the rich and famous. Like Carter, he hated being tied down, so Carter knew he would be just the person to rehash his date with. "My man," Jay said when he opened the door a moment later. From the slight slur of his speech, Carter could tell he'd already thrown back a few drinks, something that was not out of the ordinary for Jay, and had recently begun to show itself physically in the slight protrusion of his once flat stomach. "Hey, Jay, how you been?" Carter slapped Jay's outstretched hand in their secret shake and then pulled him in for a hug and a pat on the back. He tried not to breathe in the alcohol-soaked cloud that spilled from Jay's mouth. "Not too bad, man, not too bad." He stepped back and motioned for Carter to join him. "Company's been growing, so that's good. How about you?" Carter shrugged. He should be content. He'd had a great season. He was in good shape and set to have another great season. He'd just had a nice date with April and had several other women he could see going out with again. But for some reason, it wasn't enough. "I'm good." "Yeah? How was the date?" Jay walked over to the couch and grabbed a beer can from the coffee table in front of it. He lifted it, asking Carter silently if he wanted one. Carter shook his head, but joined Jay on the couch. Carter wasn't a big drinker, but mainly because he knew it impacted his performance on the field. "It was actually okay. I was a little worried at first because the guy who recommended her is kind of a religious nut, so I was afraid she would be too. But it turns out she's more like me. I might even see her again." "Again?" Jay lifted an eyebrow and took a swig of his beer. "You're not planning on getting serious with this girl, are you?" "Serious? Not likely. But I haven't even sealed the deal yet, and she is a beautiful redhead." "Ah, well, then a few more dates might be okay then." He placed his feet on the top of the coffee table and leaned back. "Do you ever think about it? Settling down, I mean?" Carter ran a nervous hand across the back of his neck. He didn't know why he was even asking. It wasn't a thought in his head, was it? It never had been before. After his mother left, he'd watched it destroy his father, and he'd decided he would never make the same mistake. But now that he was seeing many of his teammates marrying and getting engaged, well, he wasn't sure he was changing his mind, but he was thinking about the possibility. Are you crazy? I don't want to be chained to any woman. I bore too easily, and I like the challenge of a new chase. Wrinkles popped up on his forehead as he narrowed his eyes at Carter. Don't tell me you're thinking about settling down. Carter chewed on the inside of his lip before shaking his head. Even if the thought did enter his mind on occasion, Jay was not the person to share it with. Poker this weekend? He asked, changing the subject. This weekend and every weekend, my man. It's how we live the dream. Carter nodded, but he wasn't so sure that was his idea of living the dream. At least, not anymore. And that filled his stomach with dread.